This is a legacy episode of the Lesbian Historic Motif podcast, originally released as part of the Lesbian Talk Show podcast group. Some references may be obsolete. The show looks at lesbian-relevant themes in history and literature, has interviews and discussions about current historical fiction with queer female characters, including fantastic versions of the past, and presents new original historical fiction for your enjoyment. Today, the Lesbian Historic Motif podcast is delighted to feature author Stephanie Burgis. Stephanie writes historical fantasy for a variety of age ranges and includes a pleasantly diverse range of representation. I invited her onto the show to talk about the newest book in her Harwood Spellbook Regency fantasy series, Moontangled, which features a female couple. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
I'm always glad to talk with another author of Regency fantasy because, as you know, I write it myself. But you take an interesting angle on the historic setting in your series. It isn't simply the default Regency period with some magic added. You did some deep tweaking of British history to do some gender flipping in the social structure. So maybe we could start by having you tell our listeners a little about that to give them the background to your series before we talk about the specific books.
Absolutely. So the world of the Harwood Spellbook is one that deviated from our history a long time ago when Boudica first fought the Romans. Because in my version of the world, her second husband was a magician, and together they managed to kick the Romans out. At which point, the division seemed obvious. So the government of England, rather than England, is ruled by a Boudicate of female leaders, being naturally more hard-headed, practical, sensible people.
Of course.
While the men being more emotional and irrational and more suited to this sort of thing, take care of the magic. And ever since then, all these many centuries, that's been a line in the sand. But of course, anytime you put a line in the sand, someone's going to want to push past it. And finally, in my analog of the Regency era, we found a heroine who was from a powerful enough political family that when she got them on side, they were able to push her through and become the first female magician in England, which just starts a whole new circus of distress among traditionalists on both sides.
Yeah, I enjoyed how the gender flipping came out in subtle ways. Because, and I'm sure this is just part of the sort of the aesthetic choice of this series, that, things like, clothing and social customs, having balls and whatnot, is as expected because that's what makes it a Regency setting. But then things like the question of, who compromises whom if two young people are found having personal displays of affection together. And it's very subtle in some ways. But you made some interesting choices in your world building around the diversity of characters. Britain still seems to have had something resembling a colonial empire, or at least it has the demographic effects of having had one, where people come from specific parts of the world that in our world are parts of the empire.
Yes, and actually I would just interject that there's a very realistic amount of diversity,
yes.
Ethnic diversity, but a lot of it comes from different reasons, as England has actually done more partnership building among other cultures and has actually encouraged immigration in that way, with some of what are referred to. I'm trying to remember if I talk about the African empires. Certainly there's the Marathan Empire, which is where the love interest in the main body of the series, where his one of his parents came from.
And you maintain some of the dynamics by retaining class prejudices. So, the question of somebody's status, somebody's family money, whatever, then performs the dynamics that racial prejudice might have performed in the Regency.
Absolutely. And it was really interesting to think through all those little details and think, well, how could it be different? And, what's plausible, and play with all those elements.
So when you rearrange gender roles, relevant to the topic of my podcast, you've set up a structure where the social pressures against same-sex relationships are more of a practical matter because you have this very strong gender binary in the power structures, but there is no
Absolutely.
prejudice about sexuality itself. So my question is, what made you decide to take that particular path? And were there ever any plot points where you suddenly realized, it's like, oh my gosh, this problem doesn't make sense the way I've set things up because I eliminated that problem?
Well, I wouldn't say I ran into that mostly because I designed everything in a way that let me have the most fun, which is a very selfish way of writing.
Oh no, I think it's the only way.
Yeah, so that's also sort of the answer to that question because, well, I mean, to start out with completely selfishly, I'm bi. I'm always looking for more FF romance. And it didn't make sense to me not to have FF couples in the series.
Mm-hmm.
And I introduced my main FF couple. It's Miss Banks and Miss Fennel in book 1, Snowspelled, as side characters. And actually, that was very much tied in with the plot issues because in that book, Cassandra Harwood is coming to realize that she's, of course, not the only woman who wants to study magic and has been held back. She was very lucky to be the exception. But now what can she do to, pay it forward and help other women? But in fact, it plays right into that gender binary because women, although it's perfectly acceptable for them to have fun and have affairs with other women or even marry other women if they're not politically ambitious, if they want to go any further and really reach the highest political echelons, every member of the ruling Boudicat is expected to have a practicing magician as their spouse. Mm-hmm. It's mimicking that original partnership between Boudica and her second husband. And so what about two women who want to get married? And this couple has figured out, now that there has been one woman magician, mm-hmm. What if a would-be member of the Boudicat married a fellow magician and thus fulfilled the official requirements, but that trained magician could be a woman? And that's what really springboards the rest of the whole world building and the plot for this series, because it inspires Cassandra to take all this knowledge that she's been lucky enough to gain and to start paying it forward, create a magic school of her own for young women. She's the one exception who managed to get into the Great Library of Trinivantium, which is where all the male magicians, it's like Oxford, but with magic. And she was the one lucky exception to get in, but then they didn't let anyone else in after her, and everyone wanted to pretend that never happened. So she's now trying to make structural change, and it's very much inspired by coming into contact with this female couple and realizing how much benefit it would have for so many people if she could pass on some of her knowledge.
Yeah, I loved that you set up the female couple from the very first in the series. It felt a lot more promising than these series where people tell you it's like, oh yeah, eventually I'm going to get a female same-sex couple involved, but you got to wait. And it's like, no, I don't want to wait. I don't want to invest myself in books and books that don't talk about them. So I really appreciated that.
Oh, well, it's more fun for me that way. But also, the really nice thing is every time from the very beginning, when I started writing Spelled, as soon as we met Miss Banks and Miss Fennel, I thought, oh, they're fun. I want to do more with them. I want to see more of their story. Mm-hmm. And I was busy first already finishing up the first arc of the first story that I was writing, because I'm a very organic writer. Don't know ahead of time necessarily what I'm doing. But, I started with Cassandra. I wanted to tell her story. I wanted to bring it to a good stopping place, before I went on. And the thing is, because I had it in the back of my head, I was always thinking, when's the right time to tell Miss Banks and Miss Fennel's story? When is it going to feel like the right moment for that? I wanted to bring them to a crisis moment. Mm. And it turned out to come right after the end of book 2, Thornbound, because without getting too spoilerific, there's a bit of a crisis for everybody in the climax of that book, which affects this Fennel very strongly, and it affects their relationship.
Uh-huh.
And I never wanted it to be in any doubt that they're going to be fine. Because, I think I wrote an afterword to Thornbound where I specifically said, don't worry, they're going to be fine, but you can read all about it in Entangled, the next story. Because I wanted, this is supposed to be a comforting series. I wrote it as a series of escapist, comforting reads for me, and I wanted to function that way for other people. And I didn't want there to be any doubt that this lovely functioning couple we've seen until now is going to get a happy ending.
Uh-huh.
But I was always waiting to get to do that. And the best thing is, every time I've asked my newsletter subscribers, ever since the first book, Snowspell, came out, who would you like me to write a tie-in short story about? Because that's something I do quite often for all of my series. I'm like, it's just who would be fun to see more of? And overwhelmingly, I get Miss Fennel and Miss Banks. So that was a wonderful kind of affirmation.
But Moontangled isn't it's not a short story. It's going to be a novella or
a novella.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, most of your books are relatively short in the scope of the lengths of fantasy novels. Mm-hmm. So it's very easy to gobble them up in a single bite each.
That's exactly what I'm aiming for.
Now, would you describe the Harwood Spellbook series as young adult? I know that, people toss that around, whether it's a marketing term, whether it's a content-based term. They feel what I would call young adult friendly, as in people who like young adult literature will enjoy them. What do you call them?
I think they're crossover. Uh-huh. I would call them crossover books, YA adults. Because the characters are all firmly in the adult range. You couldn't publish a YA novel with characters as old as my protagonists. I've just issued a blanket statement that isn't completely true, but is most of my protagonists. And most of my protagonists are too old for the YA label. I've been very cautious as I've written because I'm also a middle grade author. Mm-hmm. And I made the decision when my first adult book, Masks and Shadows, was published that I wasn't going to publish under different names, which has led to having to be just a little bit more deliberate about what I'm going to include in my adult books, just because I know, there may be people picking it up who are not yet adults, or their parents who are quite often more important gatekeepers. Yeah. And we're more worried about upsetting. So, that's why, of course, this is a perfect solution, because I have had romance readers have been generally really lovely about not minding that I don't have any explicit sex scenes in my adult fantasy romances. Mm-hmm. But I've still had adults who enjoyed my middle grade books being really distressed that there was implied sex in those books. So,
well,
you never please everybody, but I try to be a little cautious, and my caution level is probably hitting an upper YA level when it comes to explicit sex and so on.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of physicality without, on-page sex acts, as it were. But you've got the younger series, the Cat Incorrigible series, which is also Regency fantasy, but is a different setting. It's a different world. Yes.
Yes, that's more sort of secret history.
Yeah, and that one is clearly set at a younger level. The character, when we first meet her, is, I guess, preteen. But then she grows through the series. The first book. So would you call that... is that whole series YA, or is everything you write just sort of this vague, messy mishmash of it all depends?
Well, I would call the Cat Incorrigible trilogy of books middle grade, actually, which is even younger than YA. Yeah. And that's the same age group as my Dragon with the Chocolate Heart books fit into. Yeah. However, what gets wishy-washy and nebulous with the Cat books is that I wrote a follow-up novella about Cat when she's 18. And she has a social debut, and that one I would call a YA.
Yeah, I think I was thinking of that one in that, Kat goes through this whole, sequence of experiences at different ages, all the way from, ooh, boys are icky to, her debut.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I was mentioning earlier that I write these tie-in stories for my series, and I send them out to my newsletters. And several times when I've given people the opportunity to choose who I should write about next, it's been, write about Kat, when she's an adult and has kids of her own and things like that. So I've ended up writing stories aimed at different age ranges, even though they're all about this one character, because people want to know, well, how does she, after she put her very proper, very rigid stepmother through conniptions.
Yes.
How does she deal with her own kids and so on? And it's been fun to get to return to those characters again and again.
Yeah, that series feels much more, I would say, Austen-esque to me, where you're taking very much a reflection of, not even so much the modern Regency romance genre, but much more the setting of Jane Austen, and adding magic in, and then, as you say, it's sort of a secret history. Magic is this secret feminine skill. And I have lately been having some thinky thoughts about the ways in which magic is gendered in Regency fantasy. And I suspect you have some ideas of your own on that.
I do. Yes. Well, in the Kat books, you're quite right about how Austen-esque they are, and I wrote them as a deliberate tribute. Kat is the daughter of a vicar who takes in students in his house, and Jane Austen was the daughter of a vicar who took in students in his house. So on. Jane Austen's father was known as the handsome fellow, fellow of the college, before he got married. And Kat is horrified to realize in book 2 that her father was like the romantic crush of her, the adult who's most opposed to Kat, in the magical order she's joined. It's completely humiliating to realize this sort of thing about your parents. So I based a lot of it very directly on Jane Austen's circumstance. And it's also one of the reasons why with those books, you never see anyone who's all that high up the Regency hierarchy. There are no dukes in this book or anything like that. Mm-hmm. I was keeping it to the Jane Austen level of gentility and minor nobility. When it comes to the magic, the way it's divided in Kat's world, Kat's version of England in 1803 is the first book. There are 2 different kinds of magic workers who have very different levels of respect in the secret magical world. And there's witchcraft and there's guardian magic. And you can be a witch and be a man. You can be a guardian and be a woman. But there are certainly a lot of parallels to the kind of hierarchy and what's considered okay and not. There's not a specific gender line that's drawn on, but I would say it plays with some of those tropes.
Uh-huh. And the of course the gendering of the magic in the Harwood Spellbook series is rather flipped because. But not, because I think there is this tendency in Regency fantasy for male magic to be the formal academic hierarchical magic and women's magic to be the, the more ad hoc, messy, everyday magic. So to some extent, the Harwood Spellbook series has not flipped that aspect of it.
No, it was interesting to think it all through. And of course, the heroine of Snowspell and Thornbound, Cassandra Harwood, she grew up with the perfect positioning to become one of the next great political leaders because her mother was a member of the Buddha. She's from this very old, powerful, established family. And to her, it seemed appalling. She just wanted to get into magic. That was all she wanted. But of course, I think the first time I sent a draft to a friend, she's like, wait a second. If they let women do magic, does that mean men are going to take over the politics? And you have to start thinking about this balance, which is more important, and which, of course, everyone in the society will think of differently. And that's what leads to a lot of the tension in book 2, as Cassandra's trying to do something to help out other women that's not going to completely screw over all the would-be political women also, and also aim at possibly some breakdowns of the gender binary and, aiming towards some long-term changes that way.
Now, you sent me another short story with an FF romance that I think has more of a Victorian setting, The Disastrous Debut of Agatha Tremaine. But that, it felt like, okay, I could be completely and utterly wrong here. It felt like maybe it was initial sketch of your Harwood world building, but it's clearly not. It's, it has some of the same themes. Am I completely off the road?
It's looking at their questions. It's not related in any kind of direct way, but it's definitely came from me posing the similar sorts of questions to myself as I was writing. And this is another one. It's another, I'm not sure if secret history is the right phrase for it. It's set in Victorian England, which is pretty much Victorian England as we know it, except, so it's a much more, yes, in this case, it's very much the Victorian England gender dynamic you would expect, unlike the other one. So magic is something which is supposed to be pushing forward the empire and used by men, and men are the only ones who are taught the spells to use it. So it's much more of the traditional kind of way of approaching it, as you've said. So so my heroine is someone who is fighting to be given her own independence magically as well as otherwise, and also rethinking how much of this formal training is actually necessary, if it's possible to re-envision magic and so on.
Mm-hmm. And she, literally bumps into another young woman who is equally at odds with her situation, and it's a very short story, but it's a lovely little gem of a romance where the romance is a very minor part of it, but it's still nice to see it there. So
yeah, well, it was funny because that one I was invited to write a story for an anthology called Willful Impropriety by Katerina Sidios, the editor, and I had this opening of the short story, and I'd written that a while back. So I thought, oh, well, this is my moment to figure out, because I'd started the opening and I wasn't sure exactly where it was set. I had some idea of the characters, but, I sort of set aside. And then I was asked to write a Victorian story. I was like, aha, this is it, Finally, I know where it's set. And I got partway through, and I knew there was going to be a romance for Agatha. And I kept thinking, I'm not feeling any ideas. And then she bumps into the girl, and they're both hiding from the ball. And I thought, aha, this is what actually leaving, for her. So it sort of turned the whole story around, even though the romance is not the largest aspect of the story.
So let's sort of, step backwards a few steps. How did you get interested in writing historical fiction in the first place?
I've always been a huge history geek. In fact, one of my brothers still has vivid memories that he brings up every so often of me getting out of my chores by basically selling him stories from history. I would tell him stories from history if he'd do my chores, and he did, which was amazing.
Wow.
And so I've always been a massive history geek, and I used to read up on British history for fun as a ridiculously young kid. My mom gave me Jane Eyre when I was 8, which was the same year that my dad read me Pride and Prejudice. So very, very early, I was hooked on history as a setting. It's basically, history it satisfies a lot of the same itch as fantasy for me, because they're both set in a world that's not our own, with some different rules, and you get to sort of escape into a different place when you're reading about it. Mm-hmm. So from the very beginning, I loved history. I loved escaping into it. And I also was a huge fantasy nut because the other thing that I was introduced to as a kid, of course, is Lord of the Rings very early on. And, and they're on, from Emma Bull and Patricia McKillop and all these other fantasy authors. So it just made sense to fit them together.
So we mentioned earlier, you mentioned your book Masks and Shadows, and you have sort of this, it's not so much more adult, but a darker end of your range of writing with that and Congress of Secrets. And actually, Masks and Shadows was, I think, the first book of yours that I read, and I totally fell in love with it. It's like, more, I want more like this. It's got these dark themes with, an unhappy marriage, and I think even domestic abuse, sinister plots, the struggles of single women to find a place in the world when they aren't poor enough to work for a living. And it's got this rather delightful queer love story between the heroine and a castrato opera star.
Yes.
And that was new and different. But what I'm wondering is, do you have anything else planned sort of in that dark range? I know that Masks and Shadows and Congress of Secrets are not directly tied together, except that they are both roughly a similar time period and both in Central Europe rather than in the British Isles. So anything new expected in that flavor?
Not at this moment. However, I'm definitely not ruling it out. I will say, so Masks and Shadows and Congress of Secrets are both published by Pyre Books, and I loved my editor there, Renee Sears. And at one point, I think I had just sent her an email, and I said, what would you think about a whole, I think, it was going to be something set in London, quite possibly with a zombie Handel, like the composer Handel. And she wrote back, said, ooh, write me a proposal. And the next day, I sold The Dragon with the Chocolate Heart, which is the first in a new middle grade series. And that sort of had to take priority. And right now, I'm at a situation, at a point in my life, where if I want to come up with a middle grade book and an adult book, each of them about once a year, then I have to be a bit more careful with my word count. So that's why I've been publishing primarily novellas in the last couple of years. So I have lately been feeling the yen to write another really full-length adult historical, and we'll see what happens with that. I would love to have the time to really sink into another one like that.
Yeah, I know the problem with being an actual professional, this is part of your major income writer, is that then you're kind of tied up in the whole issue of what sells well. I have yet to have that problem.
Well, I will say there are a lot of different elements in here, so I don't think I can say direct causation. I can point to any one thing for this. Because, for one thing, Masks and Shadows and Congress of Secrets, they were published by a sort of a small science fiction publisher who does really beautiful trade paperback books and quite expensive ebooks that don't go down in price. So, as it happens, I decided to self-publish the Harwood Spellbook series because they're novella length, and it made more sense than trying to publish them traditionally because of the length. But they have made much more money for me than Masks and Shadows and Congress of Secrets put together. And I don't know which part to point at. When I look back at it, I'm like, well, is it because these are the light and frothy ones, or is it because the ebooks are cheap? I don't know which bit to point at, to know, is this saying something about what my audience wants, or is this just saying something about, what people are willing to spend on an ebook or so on.
Yeah, it's hard to do controlled experiments.
Absolutely. But yeah, since I do support myself on the writing, it's something I have to be aware of. I always try to write at least one passion project every year, and actually Snowspelled was my passion project that year. I thought, I'm just going to write something, and it's going to be completely for me and fun. It was right in the wake of the 2016 election, so I was appalled by the world, and that was how I came up with the Buddha kit, which isn't a perfect system either, but it was, I I was angry enough at that point that it was great to let it out in this world where, of course, women are the only ones who are hard-headed enough for politics. And, of course, men are far too emotional for etc. So anyway, Snowspelled was my passion project. And then people really liked it, which made me incredibly happy. But then it became a serious sort of a professional endeavor after all. So if I was to write something very dark again, that would have to be my passion project that year, I think.
Yeah. So what projects are you working on now? Since by the time this podcast comes out, Moontangled will be out in the world. Anything you can tell us about to look forward to?
Well, it's slightly up in the air only because I haven't decided which I'm going to let myself write next. For my adult project. I'm not allowed to talk about my middle grade project yet. I hope by the time this podcast comes out I can, but I'm not going to make anyone angry at me by saying anything. My plan, as I was writing Moontangled, was that the next thing I wrote would be the first novella in a new series called Queens of Villainy, which is basically a series of fantasy romantic comedies about wicked queens.
Oh.
And the only downside is that when I got to the end of Moontangled, there was another female character in there, and I fell for her sort of by accident. So I do think she may need her own story too, and we're recording this in December 1st. After I finish revising Moontangled, I'll have to make a tough decision about what I play with next.
Yeah, it is. When the characters come to you and they say, but what about me? What about my story? It's very hard to turn your back on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard to turn them down.
So if people wanted to follow you on social media, where should they look?
Well, the first port of call is actually my website, because there are excerpts there of every single book I've got out, and so it's a great place to try them out and see what fits your taste. So that's stephanieburgess.com. But I also spend far too much time on Twitter, where I'm at Stephanie Burgess, and I'm also on Instagram at Stephanie Burgess in Wales. I also regularly review on Goodreads. You can look me up there, although I tend to only rave there about the books I actually really like. I read a lot of books I don't mention on Goodreads.
Uh-huh. I'll include links to all of those in the show notes, as well as links to all of the books we talked about. Thank you so much for sharing your time with the Lesbian Historic Motif podcast, Stephanie.
Thank you so much for having me.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Lesbian Historic Motif podcast. See the show notes for links to people and topics. Most shows will have a transcript linked as well. If you have a book announcement, a topic suggestion, or might like to appear on the show, please drop me an email. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate it and subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and consider supporting our Patreon.